Good morning to all. Good morning and good evening. Good morning to all those with us in Brazil. Good evening to all those with us in Asia and also in between. This is the 20th meeting of the China Analysis Group of the Brazilian Center for International Relations, CEBRI. We will be discussing today conflict and cooperation in Asia, geopolitical issues. We have today with us three very distinguished panelists and very experienced also analysts and policymakers in terms of strategic issues. We have, let me begin by introducing Andy Mock. He is currently a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing, where he concentrates on research and on technology and impact on great power relations. Before that, actually, Andy has been an investor, entrepreneur, analyst in Asia, China, mostly since the 1990s. He was also a contributor to very important research at the RAND Corporation on the United States and the rise in China, and is also a frequent contributor to issues pertaining to especially technology, artificial intelligence, and China in international media. Welcome, Andy. Welcome to be with us again.
Thank you, Tatiana.
We then have James Crabtree, who is a professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. He's also an author and journalist. James' last book, The Billionaire Rush, A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age, was shortlisted as one of the best books in 2018. Prior to that, James also worked with the Financial Times, mostly in India. He also writes today for Nikkei Asian Review. And prior to that, Andy was also a senior policy advisor to the UK Prime Minister's Strategy Unit under Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. James, we are you are very welcome to our discussion today. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's delightful to be here.
And we also come to Rudolph Lohmeyer. Rudolph, he leads the Kearney's National Transformational Institute, which is part of Kearney's Global Business Policy Council. There he dedicates to strategic thinking, planning, and strategic foresight for the future. And he advises, in this role, he advises many governments and also foreign ministries. He had also, let's say, a non-political role before as senior advisor for long-term strategic planning at the U.S. Department of State's Office of Strategic Planning, where he contributed to important and influential projects there. He also designed and directed the Department of State 2025 project in support of the Secretary of State's Bipartisan Advisory Committee on Transformation Diplomacy. And Rudolph, we are also very pleased to have you today with us. Welcome. So before passing on the floor to our first speaker today, who will be Andy, let me just briefly introduce the theme. Our theme today so will revolve on Asia, conflict and cooperation. We, especially here in Brazil, I would say in South America and Latin America, we tend to have a very economic-centered view of Asia. The rise of China, and before that, of course, in the second half of the 20th century, the rise of Japan, also very important partner for Brazil, then the Asian tigers. We understand that more and more we need a broader view to have the whole mosaic of issues that define our world today. So that's why we propose this discussion on geopolitical issues. Asia is a very diverse, complex continent that is sort of very far from us. I think would be the farthest continent from us in this region of the world, but it's more and more important. We are aware of the diversity, not only in economic terms, but also cultural, in religious terms, in terms of ethnicities and political regimes. And this also combines with all the geopolitical picture, how security and military issues combine in the region to offer a very challenging environment today. We have not only many nuclear powers in Asia, we have some of let's say unfinished business and issues of last century that are very important for us today. Not least of them, the issue of the rise of China and the reunification with Taiwan, which is one of the core issues for China. We have also growing let's say uncertainties in the South China Sea around mostly China and US rivalry, but of course that also brings on board the whole other East Asia and Southeast Asian countries. It's a delicate balance in the region as a legacy of last century, I would say as a legacy also of the Second World War. We have the United States as a strong power in the region, in the Asia Pacific. We have also the formal allies of the United States, such as Japan, Korea. We have, besides that, we have also other regional and continental partnerships and cooperation spaces in the region. So in the 90s, we had the creation of the ASEAN Regional Forum. Just to remind us, the ASEAN was established in the 60s, and then in the 90s, in 94, we had the establishment of the ASEAN Regional Forum to deal specific with issues of security and cooperation in Southeast Asia countries, and also more broadly in the continent. Today, this forum also includes other countries such as Australia, Canada, European Union, India, Japan, North and South Korea, Russia, and the US. Also in 2001, we had China and 5 other partners established the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, also with an objective of dealing with security and maintaining stability across the region. Today, we have also other members like Pakistan and India are full members, and we have many other observers. So those are 2 of the, let's say, formal cooperation mechanisms for the region. Besides that, we have many other, not only the bilateral and formal alliances in the region, but we have other relationships that are very important to the region. One of them is the partnership between China and Russia, and where it will lead to. We have also growing partnership of very growing importance for China with Pakistan. And we do have the growing, let's say, cleavage between China and India. India as one also of the largest states in the world, and also growing powerhouse that will have its rise will have also tremendous implications for Asia and the world in the next decades. So this is one other, let's say, space of conflict and cooperation that we would like to tackle. On top of all that, of course, we have the hardening of China-US rivalry in the last few years, especially along 2020 with the onset of the pandemic, or the also very much influenced by the next elections in the United States. We see more and more comparisons between China and US, military presence, especially naval military in the region. This is very, I think, maybe one of the, let's say, highest risk issues for potential hot conflicts in the world today. And this, of course, will also is more and more posing challenges to the many countries in Asia, both Southeast, North, Central, and also South Asia. So to discuss, we propose the discussion of this issue in 3 blocks that will be tackled by our speakers. First, Andy will bring us a long-term vision of China's role in the region and where this will lead us. We'll have then James bring his view, especially on China-India conflict and cooperation, and also how this relates to the other mechanisms and also to the presence of the US. And we'll have Rudolph bring us a view from the US, from US strategy to the region, or potential changes in the strategy for the future. Of course, we have also as a backdrop the issue of US and China destined for war. We are all here, we hope not, we are here to bring reflections to this world, and of course, to bring more understanding and commitment to peace. And with this in mind, I will pass the word to Andy Mock. Andy, please, and ask also our participants to send their questions to me via the Q&A function in Zoom. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tatiana, for such a comprehensive and thorough overview and setting the stage for our conversation tonight. I'm delighted and honored to have the chance to speak with such an illustrious panel of speakers as well. As you can see, the title of my talk, my brief remarks, is just how fragile is the US military and what does this mean for Taiwan and the world? So I believe this is very much in keeping with the theme of tonight's conversation. Hopefully I can share some perspectives on how this looks from Beijing. So as Tatiana said, just a little bit about me. So I had spent time at the RAND Corporation in DC doing some research, also have a business background. I'm currently at the Center for China and Globalization, which is one of the top independent think tanks, as ranked by the University of Pennsylvania Go-To Think Tank Index. And I focus primarily on the impact of technology on both hard and soft power. So this perspective informs what I'm going to share with you tonight. Okay, so I'd like to start with this idea that this has been going on for decades, but this withering of the non-military instruments of American power means that much depends on this sole tool. And if it does break, the consequences may be calamitous. And as Tatiana mentioned, Taiwan certainly is well recognized as a potential flashpoint. And I would go further and say that it might be the event that breaks the tool of American military power. So I can be a little more specific. So in the military world, it's well recognized that it's well recognized that the tip of the spear of the American military spear is indeed sharp. But I would like to offer this view tonight that while the tip is sharp, the shaft may be brittle and the hand holding it is weak. And while this has been well covered, the tip of the spear type questions have been well covered in various fora, including War Games by RAND, other think tanks reporting that what would happen militarily at a tactical level if a conflict were to break out. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I do want to mention that given the literally decades that many around the world have spent intimately studying the American military, that there is always the potential for asymmetric surprise. And we can see from this recent article in Defense News that even former Secretary of Defense Mattis talks about this operational predictability that could pose a military risk. That's all I really want to say about the tip of the spear. Let me go in a little bit more detail about what I mean about the shaft and the hand holding the spear. I'd like to start at the bottom left with ideology and governance, and then what sits on top of that in stair-step fashion would be the people, and then on top of that, military leadership, and then finally at the very top, logistics and operations. And I'll run through this pretty quickly given the time limitations, but certainly open to questions afterwards. So from an ideology and governance perspective, Yan Xuetong, a well-known Chinese scholar, has written that the key to international power is political power, and the key to political power is a morally informed political leadership, and that the moral level of a state is dependent on the quality of its leaders. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide, but I do want to point out here that in this model of understanding state power, there is also a hierarchy. So at the very top would be what is referred to as humane authority. Then in the middle is hegemony, and at the very bottom is tyranny, which is understood to mean reliance on military force as a way to establish or maintain leadership in a global context. And I think most would agree that the US probably sits between 2 and 3, so somewhere between hegemony and tyranny. And that is not the strongest position to occupy from an interstate perspective. So looking from a Chinese philosophical perspective, Xunzi, who some of you may have heard of, said this in a more wordy way that today we might say personnel is policy. Just meaning that the people in positions of responsibility determine policy and the consequent outcomes. Now here, I would suggest that the US has a profound mismatch between the skills and abilities that are needed to actually govern and those that are needed to be selected for positions of political responsibility. By contrast, in China, as some of you know, if you're familiar with the civil service exam, it's actually more difficult to join the civil service in China than it is to get into Harvard. So there's a less than a 1% acceptance rate based on a rigorous and comprehensive civil service exam in China. I believe Harvard, the acceptance rate is about 6%. Then if we look at people, similar to the way we might evaluate a military force, looking at individual morale, here meaning the willingness to fight, group cohesion and leadership. I think we're all, as we follow the election and see other, I think, signs of perhaps weaker individual morale, certainly polarization, which indicates weakening cohesion, and the leadership, perhaps we can say, is a question mark. And I think this is also well recognized by political analysts in the US. So for example, Matt Bai, a very well-known political journalist, has written that my deepest fear is that the American people get the government that they deserve. So I would say here that if we look at the second part of this stair step, that the people also is a question mark. And again, happy to answer questions about this later if there are any. Then let's look at the military leadership. And here the leadership, including the civilian leadership as well as the upper echelons of the military leadership. And I would share an anecdote with our audience tonight. So the Crozier, what I would refer to as the Modley / Crozier affair, where the captain of the, I believe it was the Eisenhower, the aircraft carrier, was relieved of duty for raising concerns about the COVID infection rate. But why I would refer to it as the Modley-Crozier affair is that Thomas Modley, then the Secretary of the Navy, as some of you may know, flew to the Eisenhower explicitly for the purpose of very publicly and harshly and perhaps disrespectfully reprimanding Captain Crozier. And I think that this raises questions about the character, the temperament, and perhaps the overall capabilities of the upper echelons of the military leadership. And this, of course, would raise doubt or cause some confidence issues among the enlisted personnel. And similarly, I think we've seen documented instances of weakening or wavering of the confidence of the military leadership in the civilian leadership as well. So I would say there are also question marks on this third stair step. Regarding logistics and operations, the high operating tempo, the related delays in maintenance, I think have put enormous stress on the Navy. As Brian Clark, who's now a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, has said, that it's hard for people outside of the Navy to recognize how challenging this is, especially for older ships like the Eisenhower. And that when you have these extended and multiple deployments, you're incurring a debt that gets bigger and bigger, and that needs to be repaid sooner or later. So I think this goes to the point of the shaft of the spear perhaps being quite brittle. Also, from a personnel perspective, these long and repeated deployments are known to be breaking both families as well as morale of the enlisted personnel. Here's something that was shared that I've seen about some of the firsthand comments about serving on some of the ships. So we can see not just some perhaps quality of life issues, but these examples of steam catapults wearing out, reducing the effective sortie rate. And you could read some of these for yourself. So I think this raises some questions then about operational readiness. So what does this mean? So from a larger geopolitical context, Anthony Eden, the UK Prime Minister, was said to have had a very expensive education, Eton and Suez. So I would argue that if there is a military conflict between China and the US over Taiwan, that this may turn out to be the US's Suez moment. And while the US leadership may not have gone to Eton, Taiwan alone may be a very expensive education in terms of learning to live in a multipolar world. And that geopolitically as well, from a global perspective, that such a tactical defeat may also offer a window of opportunity for Russia and Iran and perhaps others to make some opportunistic gains, but this would also reset the strategic environment. And then if we draw back the window to look even more broadly beyond military geostrategic issues, that this could also raise questions about the future of the dollar as well. And of course, this would have profound economic implications for the US, but also the global financial system, countries like Brazil, other countries around the world that have relied on the dollar, the US payment system, everything else that goes along with dollar hegemony. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share my thoughts tonight. I will stop here, and again, if there are any questions, please do ask, and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, very much for this very interesting and provocative presentation that brings us.
Yes, it was meant to be provocative.
Yes, that's great. We already have some questions for you. I'll come to it later. One issue that I would like maybe you to comment when we come to the questions is in terms of those the steps or the ideology, people, military leadership, and operations. Which one do you think is the brittlest, or is it really the relationship between them? But we'll come to this later. Let me pass on the floor to James. James, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Andy's being very modest here because he didn't tell you where he's speaking to us from. He's speaking, I presume, from Beijing Airport, which is obviously an enormous show of geopolitical strength, the very fact that he can be in an airport. The rest of us, including here in Singapore, are entirely stuck at home. And I presume, well, Rudolph, you could be in an airport, but you probably wouldn't want to be. So anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's 8:30 in the evening in Singapore. I'm not in an airport, I'm in my office. We must talk a little bit about India and China, and then to try and thread a needle that will pass the baton over to Rudolph to talk about the Americans. So I'm going to make 3 points. I don't have any fancy slides like Andy, I'm afraid. I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between China and India, which I think is at a very significant inflection point. I'm then going to talk about, in a sense, where that pushes India in the Indo-Pacific region. And then I want to talk a little bit about the Quad, which is much in discussion in this part of the world. And in a sense, conclude by saying that the current moment leaves both China and America with a set of dilemmas about how to proceed. And I'll try and respond to a few things that Andy said. So the thing to start, so China-India, the China-India relationship is very bad as it's been for, well, probably since the last time the two countries had a war in the mid-1960s. And I think that the change in the direction of India's strategic position is probably the most significant geopolitical change that has happened this year in the aftermath of COVID and the various foreign policy forays that China has made that have, in a sense, combined with the COVID moment to cause a reaction in certain parts of the world. And so that's a very, I'm not repeating a kind of Western canon here, but you hear people often talk about what's happened in Hong Kong, what's happening around China, in the Himalayas, et cetera, et cetera. And whatever you think about the causes of these things, they have caused a reaction that has, despite what Andy will just have said, by casting all these aspersions on American military, left China's strategic position weaker, I think, in some senses than it was at the beginning of the year, even though China has performed so well economically and during the COVID crisis. So the European Union is clearly trending against China. That's also true with other members of the Pacific, but I think India is the most significant. The change in the kind of Indian elite in the aftermath of the military standoff between India and China has been quite profound, both at the elite level and also at the level of public opinion. And so India has previously sort of tried to maintain a form of equidistance or balancing between America and China. It's been drawing gradually closer to America as China's power has risen, but it's always been mindful of not annoying Beijing and has gone kind of back and forth. It's tried at moments in which it perceives that it's drifted a little bit too close to the US. It has tried to make friends again with China. You saw that only 2 or 3 years ago in a summit between India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and China's President Xi in the city of Wuhan. But I think what's happened over the last 4 or 5 months is that India has gone much more decisively over to what you might as well call the kind of anti-China camp, which is America, now India, Australia, Japan, and various others at various different points, depending on how they're feeling. And that's really quite a significant change. It changes the kind of makeup of the Indo-Pacific and the sort of balance in the region. If you think that India, instead of being a kind of hedging, balancing power, is now to some extent going to play a more fulsome role in what the Americans want to do, which is to kind of balance, Andy would probably say contain China's rise. That also means, for instance, since we're talking to a Brazilian audience, that India is much less keen on other groupings, principally the BRICS, which I know is something that interests people in Brazil. Looked at from Asia, the BRICS really does begin to look like a pretty pointless organization now. It doesn't really have a function, highly internally divided. And so I think a country like India may see some use for that, but really the age in which India saw itself as part of this coalition of emerging powers, that was going to be its principal alignment. I think that's passing, simply because the what's happening across the Indo-Pacific is the central issue of concern for all of the powers in that region. So that's, I think, the changing balance between China and India is very significant. Point one. What does that mean for India? Point two, well, it means it's going to get pushed slightly further towards the United States. And the US, India has been trending towards the US for quite a long time, since the middle of the 2000s when they signed the nuclear agreement. And every year that passes, they get a little bit closer. Some of that is military. In fact, most of it is military, to be honest. I mean, it's military to military cooperation, which is the attractive point. But it also means that India is now proportionately more likely to be willing to do other things in relation to China. So to take part in military exercises, to engage in bilaterals and trilaterals and that sort of thing. It doesn't mean that India is going to want to lead the charge that America may want to lead in that part of the world, but I think it means it's more likely to cooperate. It's more likely to seek different kinds of partnerships. And in a sense, the relationship between India and China, it's not just because, or rather, it's not just at a military level, but it has economic and technological consequences. I mean, India was the first country to go after TikTok, which has now resulted in President Trump's rather kind of ugly and unfortunate own set of bans and attempts to use social media as a geopolitical tool. So I think India and the US are going to get closer, and that will also be true with India's relationships with other countries as well, with Japan, with Australia. I think the Indian strategic elite is going to be much more open to these kind of partnerships in the aftermath of what has happened in the Himalayas. So this is the second point, and that leads me on to the third, which is, okay, so what does that mean for this thing, the Quad? The Quad being the partnership between the US, India, Japan, and Australia. So typically India, the reason why this is significant is India has always been the weak link in the Quad. It's been the one that's most concerned about irritating the Chinese, and therefore, when the Americans in particular would say, okay, let's sort of push forward with the Quad, let's have more cooperation on this thing or that thing. More often than not, it was India which said, actually, we don't really think we want to do that. That will annoy China, and we don't particularly want to do that. We have to live in the same region as China. We want to have a reasonable working relationship with them. And the fact that India has now turned further against China means that kind of break on the Quad's activity is is just a little less strong now. And so you saw that in the fact that the Quad, although it's quite a weak grouping and rather disparate in what it's trying to do, the fact that it actually did have a ministerial meeting last week was quite significant, because at a time of quite rising geopolitical tension, typically India would not even have agreed to have such a meeting. I don't think. I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, they would have seen this as unnecessarily provocative. But last week they did have a meeting. It was reasonably high profile. They didn't manage to write a joint communique, but they clearly talked together about all of the things that matter. And I think you'll see, other manifestations of deeper relationships, either through the Quad or other, bilateral, trilateral, various different kind of formulations, potentially including kind of Quad plus groupings. Some people talk about a League of Democracies, a D9 or a D10. All of these things are quite weak at the moment. They're sort of somewhat incoherent. The Quad it's not going to become some kind of Asian NATO, which is what its more imaginative supporters and its more sort of loud Chinese critics claim is going on here. I think that, nothing like that is very likely. But there are various ways in which the Quad as an organizing principle in the Indo-Pacific could be strengthened. And I think that brings me to the kind of my 2 concluding points, which is the dilemma for the US and for China. Where I would definitely agree with Andy is that the US dilemma, well, let's say the Chinese dilemma. I think the Chinese dilemma is, how hard do you want to push your various objectives, which China has lots of objectives, many of which are perfectly legitimate, to have a greater say in the running of a region in which it is the largest economy and will probably go on to become the dominant player, whatever happens. And so China has various objectives, and it has to work out under what circumstances and when does it want to push for these. Because if it pushes very quickly in a way that startles other players in the region, then that is what will strengthen mechanisms like the Quad. The Quad is fundamentally reactive. And so at moments when China appears to be being more assertive, that brings together this balancing coalition of other powers. And that's what you've seen over the course of this year. You've seen the perception, whether right or wrong, that China has been being more assertive in various different domains. And that has brought the kind of China balancing coalition led by the US into a kind of greater alignment. So that's China's dilemma. Do you keep pushing hard and sort of risk a reaction? Or do you move forward more gently? The US dilemma, I think, is different. And Andy put his finger on it very delicately and painfully, which is that the US really is looking like a bit of a one-note machine in Asia. It has this military. Some people think it remains, by some distance, the world's premier military. Andy has sort of shed some doubt on that. Reasonable people can disagree on what its force strength is. But certainly, the US posture in Asia lacks the other instruments that would create a full orchestra. Without its commitment to free trade, it has very little to say to Asia's economic agenda. It doesn't have very much to say about infrastructure. There's a whole range of things that, for instance, the former pivot, the much derided pivot to Asia, which actually I think is given a rather hard time, but the pivot to Asia at least was a kind of full spectrum attempt to build a new strategy for American involvement in Asia. And at the moment, the risk, I think, is that the US becomes what Evan Feigenbaum at the CSIS calls the Hessians of Asia, a kind of a force in Asia which is predominantly military and without very much else to say. And so I think the question under the US, whether it's Trump or Biden, and it looks like it's probably going to be Biden, is how do you then build this broader coalition in defense of what you perceive to be the liberal, rules-based, open international order with your partners and allies in Asia, that doesn't just mean it's you coming in with some aircraft carriers and talking a military game. Because I think that is a dangerous position for the US to be into, both because it's going to be hard for the US to maintain its military predominance in Asia, but also it means you're just not talking to the kind of things that many people in Asia care about. So let me stop there and hand over to Rudolph and welcome the discussion that follows. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much. I think this is the perfect cue for Rudolph. I'll just flag one. We've been receiving many questions, and I'll mention one for James to tackle when we go to that, which is the importance of Southeast Asia to China and the USA as a middle ground. You kind of touched upon that when referring to military versus economic, but where do you see Southeast Asia regional pendulum swinging to? Rudolph, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I want to thank my fellow panelists. What a pleasure it's been to hear your perspectives. And I must say, Tatiana and team, you've done a brilliant job of orchestrating our comments in a way that I think build on, inform, and respond to one another. So I thank you for that. It's really an honor and a pleasure. I do believe that the question we're answering is arguably the most important question facing the world at this particular juncture, this critical juncture in history. And we see from the comments that we've heard already from my brilliant colleagues just how sensitive, difficult, and how uncertain they remain. Let me start by saying I have no affiliation currently with the US government or any other government. I'm actually doing this call from Dubai, where I now live, and my comments today are offered entirely personally, in no ways represent the views of my firm. We're very pleased that our little think tank is actually in the same UPenn study that Andy mentioned among for-profit think tanks, was ranked second most recently, which we're very proud of given how small we are. I've been following this issue, the question we're discussing today. It's been a privilege since the very start of my career. My first job was at Pacific Forum, which was then part of the Center for Strategic International Studies in Honolulu under the legendary Admiral Lloyd Vasey and General Joe Jordan. And I've had the privilege of following it ever since. Did my undergrad at Stanford University with Steve Krasner, was also at State when he was there as well, and did my graduate work in Chicago with John Mearsheimer. So I'm going to make comments that are not very realist in their structure. I just want you to know I'm trained as a realist by a brilliant realist, and that does, and I think that lens is extremely relevant in this context. But I do think there's a complement to it that's not often articulated. I'm going to try to take a shot at doing that. I was given a very clear set of questions. My comments are structured in terms of them, and let me just share with those who are listening, just because it'll help orient where we're going. The first question, the overarching question, was the evolving role of the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific. How does the U.S. policy of the pivot to Asia compare to the free and open Indo-Pacific? I'll start there, building on what James said. Does the U.S. have a clear strategy towards Asia? What a question, and how could it play its optimal role? And then finally, are the US and China destined for war? I must say, it's not every day that you get asked to comment on a question of such profound importance. So I appreciate the opportunity. Hope I can do it just a tad bit of justice. Okay, very quickly then. First of all, about the pivot to Asia, actually, James, might be the only thing on which we disagree slightly, because your comments actually resonated with me tremendously. The pivot to Asia, which was later called the rebalancing, and it's funny, never has a strategic narrative been rebranded with less difference than I think that rebranding in so many ways. And don't get me wrong, I believe that the underlying intent of the pivot to Asia reflects an enduring American perspective that really has not changed very much. But this is a case where its framing, its narrative framing, and its execution undermined the strategic intent below it in a whole host of very specific ways. It was defined in almost all the formulations in which it originally appeared very much in terms of this zero-sum shift from costly legacy geopolitical domains to these emerging and ever more important economically central domains. But because of that, it complicated US policy in the regions that were demoted effectively, one of which now I sit. And of course, it also, and perhaps even more importantly, it gave credence to a predatory narrative in Asia, particularly, I would argue, from a Chinese perspective, which in the context of what was already increasingly and understandably assertive Chinese policy, to see this sort of, the eyes of the predator pivoting to a new region, of course, fueled the security dilemma in ways that I think ultimately, we'll see, as Chairman Mao would have said maybe in 100 years will prove to have been unproductive in certain ways. Again, I think framing really counted, and the execution, and James said this brilliantly, so I'll be brief, the execution reflected this error, in part because of necessity, because the American military instrument, regardless of its current condition, to which, which Andy addressed a very strong perspective on, it certainly is the strongest instrument. And because of that, then this pivot to Asia was executed in ways that, although it tried to include the economic dimension, primarily in the form of the TPP, later abandoned, of course, it didn't really deliver on that at all. And it didn't deliver in a few ways that I'm going to highlight later in my comments, where I talk about what I think our strategy could be and can be optimally for all parties concerned. But the underlying intent, a free and open Indo-Pacific, where sovereign and independent nations, I'm quoting, with diverse cultures and many different dreams can all prosper side by side and thrive in freedom and peace. There is a very strong strategic argument why that is in America's enduring interest. That has oriented many of our strategies, but the narrative and the execution has really strayed from that. And so if we then turn now to the latest version of the strategy, a free and stable Indo-Pacific, if ever you wanted to see clearly the gap between political leadership and career leadership in the US government, this has been a great opportunity to see that up close. And actually, I should say that in my current job, a lot of what I do is client work. We have our little think tank. I've had a chance to see the G20 deliberations this year, up close and personal, as we say. And so what I'm going to speak to now is really not just based on study, based on having witnessed things firsthand and how those dynamics unfold. Let me explain. So the explicit contents of this new strategy are really conventional: collective security, economic growth, and good governance spread. And James spoke about it. I think the line that I read says it very well. And it's true that the strategy really is more comprehensive and balanced in many ways than prior iterations, and it has a number of strengths. However, and this is the crucial point, the strategy is deeply and arguably fundamentally undermined by the fundamental contradictions between its structure and and the assumptions underlying its structure and the broader political and policy context of which it is necessarily a part, and given the way that my country's government is structured. And so while its focus is described in exquisitely multilateral terms on paper, the broader policy context, as we all know so well, is of course explicitly unilateral. Less explicitly, because we are pretty explicitly, the current policy is explicitly unilateral in many ways, but less explicitly, the current rhetoric, narrative, and orientation is also more transactional and much more subject to what can seem to many to be arbitrary shifts that run counter to stated priorities and positions. There are many examples, unfortunately, in my view, recently, but perhaps most manifestly would be the decisions with respect to the US presence in Syria that, of course, led to General Mattis's departure. So that's one example of many cases which cause any audience to a narrative about multilateral collaboration to doubt the reliability, the depth, the meaning, the substance of those commitments. Well, when that happens, then to lead in any meaningful way, when that credibility is in doubt, is almost impossible. So it cannot be said to be clear, the strategy, one of the questions I was asked, because this tension undermines the trust and credibility required to make its core elements work, which is why I believe under that approach, it cannot work. So then what could US strategy in Asia look like going forward? How could the US play its most beneficial role in accordance with its interests, but also in the interest of the region, of course, again, in the interest of all concerned? And I'd like to explore this, realizing time is short. I've got a close eye on the clock. Tatiana, don't worry. But in terms of three trends, the first of which is really obvious, the other two a little bit less so, especially the third. Although I think Andy will appreciate these. Andy and I have a lot in common. I've done a lot of work in the technology space, especially currently, including some of the G20 work, but also in my career at Adobe Systems. But I'll get there in a moment. First of all, the increasingly shared challenges and imperatives facing all the countries of the world, including with respect, notably, of course, to pandemics and much else. Countries are laser focused on a number of challenges that they share. inclusive economic growth, notably including job creation in the context of the advance of automated systems. This is top of mind for all of the senior government officials and the CEOs to whom we speak. Food and water security, increasingly uncertain for so many countries and a crucial challenge. And of course, more broadly, environmental resilience in general, including with respect to pandemics. All of these challenges, this first trend, hinge on the power of innovation as a source of a solution. And I think that's crucial to what a US strategy in the Indo-Pacific needs to be going forward. I'll explain. But the next trend is the digital economy and its incredible growth. The digital economy was already far outstripping the rest of the economy for about 10 years. But of course, that's been radically accelerated by COVID-19, as we all know. And now the growth is really quite stunning, of course. And crucial to understanding the digital economy is the extent to which the value that it can generate for the economies participating in it is a function of the cross-border flow of data, the interoperability of systems, which of course is a big part of why technology has become such an intensely contentious domain of competition, not just because of its crucial, probably preeminent military implications, but also because of its implications for economic growth, value creation, and prosperity. Which brings me to the third trend that I think is crucial to understanding what US strategy in the region needs to be, and indeed how the region needs to think about its own strategy, its leaders. And that's the geography of innovation-driven value creation. And right now it's actually very uncertain, although we start to get directionality that we didn't have even 18 months ago, as I'll try to explain. So this trend refers to the extent to which the economic value creating power of technology and technological expertise is either, on the one hand, concentrated in a limited number of pure technology clusters, Silicon Valley being an example. There are several in China. There are only a handful in the world. Or is it instead distributed across sectors in complementary alignment with localized domain expertise? This is a technical point. Andy knows that to which I'm referring. It has to do with how AI can or cannot disrupt industries. Some argue that AI may achieve levels of sophistication in which it can disrupt industries without any domain expertise. And this, of course, would orient the world towards a limited number of very, very dominant clusters. And that future is one that is actually quite possible. Or it may be, and the evidence is leaning in this direction lately, that value creation will require the integration of AI with sector and domain specific capabilities. If so, because there's a much greater distribution of those pockets of domain expertise globally, then a much larger numbers of economically value creating clusters can emerge. And setting aside which of those will happen, I think we can agree that with a possible exception of two countries, the two countries that we're discussing today, that latter pathway would be in the interest of the planet in terms of inclusive economic growth globally. And so in that context, if you think about a world being shaped by those forces and by those choices, there's an opportunity, I believe, I would like to argue, there's an opportunity for the United States to craft a new strategy in the Indo-Pacific. And the strategy, I believe, can center on genuinely creating a space, a physical, economic, and digital space governed by an agreed set of rules with compelling and visible benefits to those participating in it. What do I mean? This is different in substance from what has been articulated for a long time verbally and abstractly, which is a set of economic partnerships in which the real problems facing countries are addressed through the partnership in ways that are transparent. Why transparent? Transparency for its own sake? No. Transparency because the visibility of the benefits to the parties. And we're talking way beyond the Quad. In fact, the Quad is one construct, could theoretically be the kernel of such a thing, but because the orientation of the Quad is so explicitly adversarial in so many ways, the intent of this initiative is instead to build a space of value creation that's rule-based, that's transparent, that genuinely solves problems for people on the ground, citizens, thereby giving political cover to their leaders, that it becomes attractive and that it expands. And it's not, I am not explicitly stealing from one of my heroes, Zbigniew Brzezinski, but in his book, Strategic Vision, he discusses the prospect of American-European alignment on a set of principles in which some of this same logic is embedded. I'm making a case that is analogous structurally to that in the case of the Indo-Pacific, creating regional and global public goods in transparent ways. Of course, the military dimension is crucial. Knowing where to draw red lines and how to navigate them is crucial, but that's not the focus of this recommendation. And so in my view, the current strategy, and perhaps too much American strategic discourse in general, is focused so much on positioning and framing and narrative, and and with significant doses, by the way, of mirror imaging, as we all know, mixed in with respect to China, but very much an insufficient focus on actual results. And I think this is the opportunity that a new American strategy could have. And in this way, and I think this is really maybe the central point, it's where an American strategy is no longer an American strategy. It's something more than that, as I will hope to explain. Now to part 3, in the limited time remaining. Are we destined for war? There can be no denying that the dynamics we are witnessing are extremely fragile. We all know it, but just quickly, 3 reasons from my perspective. First, the intentional and explicit affirmation of decoupling and the move towards decoupling. We know it's mathematical, axiomatic, I would argue, that as interdependence diminishes, so too do the apparent costs of conflict. So this is a huge source of concern. When the leaders of the 2 greatest powers in the world are talking explicitly about decoupling for my children, the youngest of whom's grandparents, godparents are Chinese, forgive me, I get worried. Secondly, miscalculation in the context of the American domestic crisis. I think we all know, and in fact, the thing that is, of course, you can imagine most concerning me and so many Americans right now, is that there is a very real prospect of a constitutional crisis associated with the upcoming election. And to the extent that that unfolds, there's certainly bound to be some degree of that, but to the extent that that becomes deep, it could easily create incentives for China and for others to miscalculate American resolve, or perhaps accurately calculate American resolve, be that with respect to Taiwan, or even more likely other actors in the region, which brings me to third-party risk. As we all know, Graham Allison, in his analysis of the Thucydides trap and how it's played out over time, says in almost all cases, it's third parties. It's a third-party provocation that forces the great powers to react, and then the wider conflict spirals and cascades from that point. Well, North Korea remains incredibly fragile. The dynamics between India, Pakistan remain fragile. As James said, of course, that these are not, only one of these would be a third party in the context of what we're speaking about right now, but the India-China dynamics in the mountains, of course, are very fragile. And indeed, there are many other wild cards not even accounted for here. And one perhaps can always has to be aware of the prospect of Russia seeing an opportunity to ignite, facilitate, or enable something to the extent that it seems to be in its interest. And so having said all of that, all of those conditions suggest how fragile, how high the risk of war is. I believe that it is very unlikely that open conflict between China and the United States will unfold simply because the costs remain too catastrophic. One of the benefits of having been a consultant for the last 6 years and seeing things up close is just realizing how vulnerable those things on which countries depend for everything to which they aspire is to a conflict, even if they win it. In the current landscape of military capabilities on both sides. So for that reason, I think that's unlikely, but gray zone warfare, cyber warfare, to which we've done, which is a major focus of so many clients right now, the cognitive domain, the informational domain, which we see manifested in social media manipulations of political outcomes. Arguably, that conflict, that war, if you will, is already underway, and I think it's very likely to intensify until there is a shift in the strategic approach. And so let me just conclude by saying that in avoiding war, I believe that the burden is on the United States in many ways. The burden is on the United States to build a strategy in the region so focused on benefits, so accessible to others, that it would make conflict against the interest of the parties. And there are examples, of course. First of all, this is a very American idea. At the founding of America, the harnessing of diversity, the harnessing of diversity to drive collaborative innovation, that's the idea on which this concept rests, is of course, was true at the founding of our country, but more recently, at its best, and there are huge flaws and weaknesses, but of course the EU represents an analogous concept of an agreed set of rules with accretive benefits to each one who adds, if they can agree to those. Those are the dynamics I think that the US needs to attempt to lead in the region. And to the extent that it does so, and forgive me for being a little bit poetic, but to the extent that it does so, it wouldn't be a US strategy. It would be a human strategy. That is centered on human-centric benefits. So countries coming together to create regional public goods for their citizens in unassailable and transparent ways that become a magnet for others to join and stabilize a region that otherwise is at risk of a devastating conflict. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rudy. This has been a very insightful remarks, broad and insightful, and I think they bring us, it finishes the first part of our conversation on a positive note. We have even a new sort of American world dream, and we can also see the importance, going back to where I started, of economics and development, of course, economics and diplomacy on that. And we are all happy for that. So thank you. Let's let me just mention one question that maybe you could think for later, that is especially the way that the China-Russia alliance plays, and how do you see, you know, this alliance going forward, and from the US view, how both Eurasia and Central Russia, Central Asia and China alliance could go forward. How do you see the US view on that evolving? So let's go to, I'll go back. Let me go back first to Andy. We do have a few questions on Taiwan, as we could expect, Andy. So I'm just putting it together. So I think the main issue here is, you know, how real is this threat of a war around Taiwan today? Is it an invasion by, you know, of China, a Taiwan invasion of China? Is it possible? And one other interesting question related to that is, do you see a difference, Andy, between top military leadership and top political leadership in the US?
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, thank you for those two questions, Tatiana. So in regard to how real is the risk of conflict, certainly it seems like the risk is much, much higher than it was a year or so ago. And I think what has changed has not been the Chinese position, but that the US, as you know, part of this broader bipartisan kind of galvanization of pushing back against China across a number of fronts, I think has resulted in this higher risk of a military conflict, which goes back to my earlier point that, you know, there are, I think, very clearly enunciated red lines on China's part. And as we saw with President Xi, or General Secretary Xi's recent visit to the south of China and his visit to a Marine base, that China needs to be ready to fight. And I think the clear implication was about or over Taiwan. And if the US continues or escalates what I think China sees as these highly provocative actions, or if we want to think about it, as Rudy said, as a third party, if Taiwan decides that, or if it reaches a conclusion that the US would step in, that we could see a military conflict. And I think that's an unfortunate reality. Now, to your second question about difference between the military and civilian leadership, I think clearly there is. look at, I believe it was under then Secretary of Defense Mattis, that there was this description of slow walking President Trump's initiatives. And I think this notion of a deep state, that there is some reality to that in the US. You know, it's seen and described in a humorous way in the UK in shows like Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. But the career bureaucrats versus the political appointees, that there's always these differences. But I think they've been exacerbated under President Trump. And I thought that Rudy did a really great job of articulating a more universalist vision that the US could adopt. But I think that where I would perhaps not agree is that these differences are only under this current administration, but this current administration is only a difference in degree and not kind, because we see in particular, if we have a switch in party, that policy directions, sentiment can change quite dramatically as well.
Thank you, Andy. Let me, because I know you have to catch a flight soon. So let me just pop, bring one more question to you and for your comments, and then I'll go to James and Rudolph. Andy, we have lots of questions about Belt and Road. How do you see Belt and Road connecting with China's geopolitical military strategy in the future? And also, please feel free to make any other comment about about the initial remarks, because I know you have to go in about 7 minutes.
Sure. Well, I think that the starting point for this are the official government statements, and to more completely understand the context for these government statements, of which, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative is one, is the party ideology and the thinking behind it. So we can, from an international relations perspective, perhaps take a very materialist view of the world. We can also take perhaps a conceptual view. And I think the way the party thinks about it and spends a lot of energy and time researching and articulating is a coherent ideology. Almost we can think of it as a kind of religion, meaning how should the world work and what do we need to do in it? And the Belt and Road is one part of that, which is, I think China's version of a universalist vision of creating a community of shared future for mankind. And the Belt and Road Initiative is a lower level manifestation of that fairly abstract idea, meaning that there are policies, there are agreements that then can be the foundation for the next layer of, say, transactions or institutions like the AIIB, other institutions like that. So that's how I would understand it, that the intention is that there is an internal integrity to this and that it does fit in a larger coherent worldview. And maybe as a reaction to a couple things. So James mentioned that the Quad is more of a reaction than a proactive policy initiative. I would perhaps say that there is a question mark on that, at least amongst, as I'm sure James knows, amongst some Chinese policy analysts and government officials, that it's actually seen as a very proactive, orchestrated effort that is not reactive at all. About India, I agree with James absolutely that there has certainly been a change in tone. I wonder about the effectiveness of it, though, because when we look at India, which is bordered by Pakistan, and of course this is an enormous strategic distraction, but also Nepal and Sri Lanka, which although are not large states, I think occupy a disproportionate amount of psychic space when it comes to India's foreign policy. Bangladesh, I think, is a bit of a question mark as well. So I don't doubt that there's been a shift in intent with India with respect to China, but I do have a question mark about the effectiveness that it will be able to deliver as part of a Quad if this Quad does mature more. And then to Rudy's point about the predator kind of gaze shifting, I just wanted to share that I wrote a recent piece about this, about the eye of Sauron turning its gaze towards China. So I think there certainly is that view, at least amongst some circles here. And that I would say that technology is very important, to Rudy's point, very much so, of course. But I would say equally as important is the ability to innovate with rules. And we look at a place like Shenzhen, which we can think of as kind of a pilot city level experimental zone, a policy experimentational zone. And one reason I think it's been so successful is there is a certain threshold of technology that must be crossed, but much more vital was the ability to design and implement rules that foster stability and economic growth. And we've seen attempts elsewhere in the world, for instance, in Honduras, where these kinds of efforts did not get off the ground, largely due, I would suggest, due to these the lack of either sufficiently granular rules or the implementation of those rules. So I would bring this back again to the party, where these rules occur not in a vacuum, but part of an integrated, internally consistent worldview and set of principles.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
I probably should sign off now, but again, thank you all very much. It's been an honor. I certainly learned a lot from James and Rudy, and I thank you, Tatiana, and the rest of the CEBRI team for this opportunity, and I hope our audience enjoyed this as much as I did.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Have a safe flight.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Safe
Honor
travels.
to have you again. Yeah. Rudolph, do you want to comment, to pop in now?
I did, and we're going to lose Andy. Andy, if you have 10 seconds, I only wanted to say that I'm sure Andy's aware of it, but we're watching with keen interest a few experiments, notably the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement between Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand, as you know, is an experiment in a rule-based. They're going to try to work on digital identity management standards in common, IP standards in common, to create a cross-border innovation environment that's powerful. I think that's another experiment in the same spirit worth watching. But safe travels. Yeah,
thank you. I wanted to go to James, maybe. James, we have had, of course, you are also free to react on any, of the other panelists' comments, but we did have many questions, not only on something that you alluded to in your remarks concerning how, for example, India-Japan partnership will affect China, but also especially how Southeast Asia really, how this the China-India cleavage affects Southeast Asia. What are their respective policies for Southeast Asia, and then how could the region play its role in regional mechanisms in the future? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things. So firstly, I was enormously heartened to hear of Rudolph's very optimistic vision for a new American role in the Indo-Pacific. And, it'll be a great day if something like that actually begins to happen, but it doesn't seem to be much sign of it. I mean, it seems like a great idea. The notion that the US and its partners could suddenly come around creating huge numbers of public goods which build goodwill and economic opportunity. I mean, I like the sound of this very much. I just don't see very much evidence of it. So I hope he's got a line into the Biden administration and he's suggesting this, and that they they go at it with full force. Yeah, it'd be good. I mean, the problem with this is it's a sort of, even if you imagine that the US could begin to, with its partners and friends, begin to play this kind of role, and there's all sorts of practical things that one could do. We need rules that govern artificial intelligence and electric vehicles and data localization and There's a ton of Rudolph had some kind of clever language about this, but sort of, what was it you said, value creation. There's a lot of value creation out there, but we're now in a world that's much more realist, to use Rudolph's other phrase, about the nature of Chinese power, and so this is much more of a kind of zero-sum model of Asia, where the countries that are anxious about rising Chinese power are trying to work out what to do about this and where they should take a stand and where they should try and kind of make China's actions more costly, whether that's in the technological domain, which has been a big focus of US power, or potentially in the military domain as well. And so these things are kind of in tension, even if you imagine it might be possible to have a more positive, constructive, economic, unifying agenda that's rather in tension with the more zero-sum kind of power balance agenda. And it's hard to see how they can coexist with one another. It may be possible, but it would require some very deft statecraft. On Southeast Asia, well, Southeast Asia is the kind of the test of all of this, really, because I mean, the mantra, so I live in Singapore, but the mantra that you hear in Southeast Asia is don't make us choose. And so if the American strategy, as it has been over Huawei around the world, has basically, over Huawei, the American strategy has basically been, you're either with us or you're against us. Either you use Huawei or you don't. We don't want you to use it. And gradually, a lot of America's friends have come round to the American point of view. It looked initially like they wouldn't, but more and more have become more suspicious of this. But if this is a model of what's to come, in which the US effectively says that you're either with us or you're against us, then a lot of people, particularly those who are very close to China, eventually are going to decide, well, we're going to have to be against you, because in a sense, we have to live with China. They're in our backyard. They're our most important economic partner. And so that's what you hear in Southeast Asia. The phrase is don't make us choose. We don't want to have to choose. We want a world in which the US continues to play a substantial economic role and military role in Asia, but we also recognize that China is a big rising power, and therefore we don't want a China that is kind of dissatisfied with its lot. So we have to come up with some new architecture in Asia in which these two powers can get along with one another without fighting. And also we, as in Southeast Asia, we get to in a sense, trade with both sides. That, economics is what drives a lot of these relationships. And so Southeast Asia doesn't want to have to pick either the kind of the Westernosphere, the free and open Indo-Pacificosphere, or the Sinosphere. But the problem is that the space for not having to choose is just getting narrower because of the geopolitics of the situation. Technology is the most obvious respect in which this is true, where it's increasingly becoming much more difficult to use American technology if you want to do deep business with China, and probably vice versa as well. The same will be true, but this is going to be true in lots of other domains as well. And that's when you're not talking about outright decoupling, you're talking about sort of fragmentation of these kinds of relationships. And so so the Southeast Asia its position is complicated. Strategically, it doesn't want America to leave the region, and it's always been worried that the US may, as a superpower, get distracted and get involved in another war in the Middle East. And so almost all of the countries in Southeast Asia want the US to stick around in one form or another. They also want India to become more powerful, because that also helps. Nobody wants to live under a Chinese hegemon, whatever Andy might have you believe, or might have had you believe, with his typology of whatever it was, hegemony and tyranny, wherever the US was located. But nobody wants to kind of live under the Chinese yoke. And so, it's useful to have America in the region as a kind of balancer, and it would be useful to have India as well. But so to cut a long story short, Southeast Asia's position is complicated, and ASEAN as an institution is becoming weaker. I don't think there's really any doubt about that. And this has definitely been proven during the coronavirus pandemic, where ASEAN has done very little, and you can see the fundamentally bilateral instincts of countries in the region. And so it's the sort of the phrase you hear here, ASEAN centrality, that ASEAN should be the sort of central organizing principle of this region, and that all of the superpowers should kind of work their way through ASEAN. The starker the geopolitical divide becomes between China on the one hand and the Quad countries on the other, the less central ASEAN is to the future of the Indo-Pacific. And that is also something that gives countries in ASEAN, a lot of reasons for anxiety.
So this sort of leaves us, there is, as you mentioned before, the Quad is not very institutionalized, right? So it leaves us somewhat with a vacuum in terms of institutions for really cooperation in the region that are so inclusive as for example, the ASEAN Regional Forum. Rudy, if you could comment on, or in any other issue that you might want to react, but also on the issue of Russia, China, partnership, or also competition could be in the future. And I think there is one question here that would be perfect for you, which relates to how actually global tech companies, both from USA and China, they may influence the direction of conflict.
That's a fascinating question. Let me jump into those very, very quickly, but I cannot resist responding to James's fascinating comments, and they're so important, and they betray such an understanding of the intent I tried to convey. So I thank you for that. I was tempted when I did the comments, and we still could, right, just totally strip away anything but a purely realist analysis, when we posit sort of an offshore balancing approach, strengthen those, and create an architecture that is inherently stable. We know that often a bilateral structure historically is more stable than a multilateral one. And so then, if that's to the extent that's true, and history would suggest it is, then efforts to stitch together a number of countries from a security standpoint in a way that serve as sort of a proxy for more of a bilateral balance of power, then productive things can happen. And again, this is a frontier of discomfort. Certainly John Mearsheimer would scold me and say, what the heck are you talking about? But I want to make an analytic case for it to everyone for our benefit, and in particular in response to James's great question, which is absolutely, but give them something else. Give them something else to respond to. So to the extent that it were possible to begin building, even a bilateral relationship, the US with Indonesia, but even more so with a few others, where there became a dynamic in which really tangible, on the ground problems were being solved, this would by its nature expand. And by having it there, I believe, this is the hypothesis, James and everyone, the hypothesis is that then alters the calculations with respect to conflict elsewhere. So over time, as it gathers momentum, then a domain among countries really laser focused on not transactional free trade agreements, bilateral deals that are often asymmetric, but genuinely beneficial in measurable and visible ways, that this over time would create a space in the region that would make it less in China's interest to push boundaries in ways that could alienate its ability to access that market. And there's one crucial piece of that. Why do I think that's not so as implausible as it might sound? And that is if Biden were elected, if we were to then see, and by the way, I'm a committed centrist, a registered independent, you should know, Scowcroft and Brzezinski are my guiding lights. But if Biden were to be elected and return to not just multilateralism, but to, for example, an environmental orientation with respect to regulation, much more aligned with the EU, to the extent that there were a transatlantic alignment on regulatory framework around environmental issues and much else, including technology, that combined weight, the gravity of that space would be a complement to what I was suggesting might be possible to begin in embryonic form in the region. in ways that I think would just create very strong incentives for the Chinese to buy into, to plug into it, and it would organize the negotiations with the Chinese on the most sensitive points of that, which would be very helpful. Sorry, it took me forever to say that. Now, to Russia and China, you know, the old mentors of mine just point out that, first of all, we know there's such extreme economic and demographic complementarities between the two countries that their alignment makes great sense on paper, and yet, and to some extent because of those complementarities, a lot of open space in the West, a lot of people below that line, a lot of energy resources in that space, a whole host of things have historically kept them from ever getting too close. And I guess my assessment is that that will continue to be the case, but at any given point in time, their alignment can be total and decisive. And so I think, I wasn't sure if the question was from a US perspective. I would only say that at any given point in time, a high degree of Chinese-Russian alignment on any given issue is extremely likely and always has to be factored in. And when that's factored in, of course, it's got a huge implications. Global technology companies, last point, I'll try to be more efficient. I think they have a huge role to play. You know, we're seeing something now nobody ever expected. Many of the technology leaders are going to Congress, going elsewhere, asking to be regulated. They are trying to proactively say, let's form these regulations together, because in its current status, it's costly, it's distracting, and crucially, to the other idea, it's fragmented. So these global technology giants have an interest in a more unified regulatory landscape. They're pushing for it. To the extent that occurs, to the extent that space of commonly governed spaces on consistent rules exists, they make more money, and the incentives for conflict diminish. So I didn't mean to wear such a utopian hat today. I'm trying to make the argument based on incentives, but I think that those companies can play a huge and very positive role.
Thank you, Rudolph. We are getting to the end of our meeting, but I wanted to give you, both you and James, time to say something as final remarks, if you wish, or before I can close the session.
I feel like you gave me my chance, so I'm gonna cede my time to my friend James. Please go ahead, sir.
Great.
I think you're a very curious sort of Mearsheimer realist in the kind of ideas you're coming up with, Rudolph. I feel you've strayed some way from the path of offshore balancing into some kind of something that the master himself wouldn't very much approve of.
May I say, James, before you say something, I want to tell you about him. The debate was even back in school, and much to his credit, he always honored and respected the debate on that. So remarkable guy. Go ahead, sir. Sorry.
No, I mean, I guess, as I say, I think I'm a bit more skeptical than Rudolph that this kind of thing is possible, and that the US almost has the capacity for this kind of imagination anymore. I wish that this wasn't the case, but I hope that it is. And it is certainly the case that, as I said in my remarks, that if the US follows a kind of primarily military strategy in this part of the world, where it has nothing more to offer in Southeast and Central Asia and beyond than kind of warships, then in the long run, this is a losing strategy. The US has to be part of a kind of a coalition that is functional, that is talking to the agendas that people are worried about in this region. There's all sorts of problems, from managing the pandemic to the next stage of economic growth, to how you manage trade and globalization, all sorts of issues of common concern, which need to kind of come alongside the military hard power geopolitical balance. And so if the US isn't able to do that, then I think, in a sense, the game ultimately will be lost. I think there's an interesting, here's a final thought for you, which is about Biden. I've been thinking quite a lot about what happens under a potential President Biden. One of the interesting things is that President Biden is less popular than you might imagine in parts of Asia. I think amongst kind of liberal Europeans and Americans, the notion is, everyone hates Trump, and they'll be glad to see the back of him because they see him as a complete menace. And I know that in Brazil, he's pretty popular with Mr. Bolsonaro, so I should be careful what I say. But I think actually in the parts of Asia that I've been talking about, to some degree, certainly in parts of Japan and India, Australia, even in some bits of Southeast Asia, there's no great memory of the Obama era. Those who were worried about the rise of China thought the Obama era was, they took their eye off the ball in the South China Sea. They had this pivot to Asia, which, as Rudolph said, promised much and then under-delivered. They used to come and wag their finger at us and talk about human rights and were generally a pain. And at least Trump, and for those who are worried about China, at least Trump, for all his other problems, had the merit of being pretty tough on China in various different domains. You can argue about the effectiveness, but clearly he's given Beijing things to think about. And so I think Biden, were he to win, he has his work cut out. It isn't that he's going to be welcomed with open arms in this part of the world. There's a lot of residual skepticism about whether a Biden administration is simply going to be kind of all talk and no trousers and fundamentally domestically focused on trying to get the US recovery back on track. And so, in a sense, I think where Rudolph and I agree is that the US under a new administration, I mean, goodness knows what happens if the current one gets back, but under a new administration, really does need a period of very imaginative policymaking, both in order to try and deliver, both to kind of manage this very complicated, potentially dangerous military sort of spiral which is going on at the moment, but then also to be part of, but potentially not always the leader of, a much more imaginative kind of economic dimension. And then to sort of bring all of that together, it's going to require great statecraft, and it's going to be interesting to see whether Joe Biden and his advisors are kind of up to this task. But I don't think that they should think that Asia is going to kind of roll over and let the United States tickle its tummy when were a Biden administration to come. Actually, there's going to have to be many more elements of continuity from the Trump era than perhaps liberals in the US and the rest of the world may be comfortable with. So.
Thank you so much, James, for this summing up. It's, I think, statecraft is of the essence everywhere, and it's very difficult to. We'll have, in this China analysis group, we always have reports, and we do have all the reports available on CEBRI's website, and we'll also make a report of this meeting, which will be really a challenge. It has been so dense, insightful, and touched upon the very maybe most important issues for geopolitics in our time. We are very, very fortunate to have you two and also Andy with us today. I think we couldn't have a better session than that. I attempt to say that I was trying to say, how could I sum up? And like from principled realism to real human principled realism, or something like a real human realism, or something like that. But anyway, I'll not be. I promise not to be so simplistic in our report, and we'll try to bring on board the very important views. I want to thank, of course, you, James and Rudolph, and to thank the participants that have been with us today. We have over 160 people. We have so many comments. I already received many messages, both in Zoom and then my WhatsApp, saying how insightful this session has been. And I want also to say that this is the 20th session. This will be the last session in which I'll coordinate the China Analysis Group. It has been a fantastic journey of over 3 years, since September 2017. I thank very much CEBRI, Julia, for her original invitation and all the support I got from CEBRI, from President Pio Borges, from Ana Jaguaribe. We worked together in the Asia program, and for all this team from Cinta and all the team from CEBRI. And I also thank always our participants. And of course, I wish a long life for this China Analysis Group, and I hope we'll have many more sessions like that. It has been, like I said, a fantastic and very rewarding journey for me. So with that note, I will just thank you very much. And I will ask also for, it's a big applause for our speakers.
Oh, Tatiana, we thank you for your brilliant orchestration of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rudolph. Thank you, James. Have a great day. Have a good night.